Kinderman had checked Carl Engstrom's story regarding his whereabouts at the time of Dennings's death. The show times matched, as did the schedule that night of a DC Transit bus. Moreover, the driver of the bus that Carl had claimed he had boarded near the front of the theater went off duty at Wisconsin and M, where Carl had stated he'd alighted at approximately 20 minutes after 9. A change of drivers had taken place, and the off-duty driver had logged the time of his arrival at the transfer point, precisely 9:18. Yet on Kinderman's desk was a record of a felony charge against Engstrom on August 27, 1963, alleging he had stolen a quantity of narcotics over a period of months from the home of a doctor in Beverly Hills where he and Willie were then employed. Born April 20, 1921, in Zurich, Switzerland. Married to Willie née Braun September 7, 1941. Daughter, Elvira, born New York City, January 11, 1943, current address unknown. Defendant. The remainder the detective found baffling. The doctor, whose testimony was deemed a sine qua non for successful prosecution, abruptly, and without explanation, dropped the charges. Why had he done so? And as the Engstroms had been hired by Chris MacNeil only 2 months later, the doctor had given them a favorable reference. Why would he do so? Engstrom had certainly pilfered the drugs, and yet a medical examination at the time of the charge had failed to yield the slightest sign that the man was an addict, or even a user. Why not? With his eyes still closed, the detective softly recited the beginning of the Lewis Carroll poem, Jabberwocky. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabber." It was another of Kinderman's mind-clearing tricks, and when he had finished the recitation, he opened his eyes and fixed his gaze on the Capitol Rotunda. He was trying to keep his mind a blank, although, as usual, he found the task impossible. Sighing, he glanced at the police psychologist's report on the recent desecrations at Holy Trinity. Statue. Phallus. Human excrement. Damien Karras, he had underscored in red. His breathing slightly whistling in the total silence, he reached for a scholarly work on witchcraft and turned to a page that he had marked with a paperclip. Black Mass, a form of devil worship, the ritual consisting, in the main, of 1. Exhortation, the sermon, to performance of evil among the community. 2. Coition with the demon, reputedly painful, the demon's penis invariably described as icy cold, and 3. A variety of desecrations that were largely sexual in nature. For example, communion hosts of unusual size were prepared, compounded of flour, feces, menstrual blood and pus, which then were slit and used as artificial vaginas with which the priests would ferociously copulate while raving that they were ravishing the Virgin Mother of God or that they were sodomizing Christ. In another instance of such practice, a statue of Christ was inserted deep in a girl's vagina while into her anus was inserted the host, which the priest then crushed as he shouted blasphemies and sodomized the girl. Life-sized images of Christ and the Virgin Mary also played a frequent role in the ritual. The image of the Virgin, for example, usually painted to give her a dissolute, sluttish appearance, was equipped with breasts which the cultists sucked and also a vagina into which the penis might be inserted. The statues of Christ were equipped with a phallus for fellatio by both the men and the women, and also for insertion into the vagina of the women and the anus of the men. Occasionally, rather than an image, a human figure was bound to a cross and made to function in place of the statue, and upon the discharge of his semen it was collected in a blasphemously consecrated chalice and used in the making of the communion host, which was destined to be consecrated on an altar covered with excrement. This. Kinderman flipped the pages to an underlined paragraph dealing with ritualistic murder, reading it slowly while nibbling at the pad of an index finger, and when he had finished he frowned at the page and shook his head, then lifted a brooding glance to the lamp. He flicked it off and left his office. He drove to the morgue. The young attendant at the desk was munching at a ham and cheese sandwich on rye and was brushing the crumbs from a crossword puzzle as Kinderman approached him. "Dennings," the detective breathed out hoarsely. The attendant nodded, hastily filled in a 5-letter horizontal, then rose with his sandwich and moved down the hall. "Down this way," he said laconically. Kinderman trailed him, hat in hand, following the faint scent of caraway seed and mustard to rows of refrigerated lockers, to the dreamless cabinet used for the filing of sightless eyes. They halted at locker 32. The expressionless attendant slid it out. He bit at his sandwich, and a fragment of mayonnaise-speckled crust fell lightly to the graying shroud. Kinderman stared, and then, slowly and gently, he pulled back the sheet to expose what he'd seen and yet could not accept. Dennings's head was turned completely around and facing backward. Chapter 5. Cupped in the warm, green hollow of the Georgetown University campus, Damien Karras jogged alone around an oval, cinder-covered track in khaki shorts and a cotton t-shirt drenched with the cling of healing sweat. Up ahead, on a hillock, the lime-white dome of the astronomical observatory pulsed with the beat of his stride, while behind him the medical school fell away with churned-up shards of earth and care. Since release from his duties, he came here daily, lapping the miles and chasing sleep. He had almost caught it. Had almost eased the grief that clutched his heart with the grip of a deep tattoo. When he ran until he wanted to fall, exhausted, the grip grew much looser and at times disappeared. For a time. 20 laps. Yes, better. Much better. 2 more. With powerful leg muscles blooded and stinging and rippling with a long and leonine grace, Karras thumped around a turn when he noticed someone sitting on a bench to the side where he'd laid out his towel and his sweatsuit jacket and pants. It was a portly, middle-aged man in a floppy overcoat and a pulpy, crushed felt hat. He seemed to be watching him. Was he? Yes. His stare always following as Karras passed. The priest accelerated, digging at the final lap with pounding strides and then slowing to a panting, gulping walk as he passed the bench without a glance, both fists pressed light to his throbbing sides. The heave of his muscular chest and shoulders stretched his t-shirt, distorting the stenciled word philosophers inscribed across the front in once black letters now faded by repeated washings. The man in the overcoat stood up and began to approach him. "Father Karras?" Kinderman called to him hoarsely. The priest turned around and tersely nodded, squinting into sunlight as he waited for the homicide detective to reach him, then beckoned him along as once again he began to move. "Do you mind? I'll cramp," he said pantingly. "Not at all," the detective answered, nodding with a wincing lack of enthusiasm as he tucked his hands into the pockets of his coat. The walk from the parking lot had tired him. Have we met?" asked the Jesuit. "No, Father. No, we haven't. But they said that you looked like a boxer, some priest at the residence hall, I forget." He was tugging out his wallet. "I'm so terrible with names." "And what's yours?" "Lieutenant William F. Kinderman, Father." He flashed his identification. "Homicide." "Really?" Karras scanned the badge and identification card with a shining, boyish interest. Flushed and perspiring, his face had an eager look of innocence as he turned to the detective and said, "What's this about?" "Hey, you know something, Father?" Kinderman answered with an air of sudden discovery while inspecting the Jesuit's rugged features. "It's really true. You know, you do look like a boxer." "Excuse me, but that scar there right over your eye." He was pointing. "Just like Marlon Brando, it looks, in on the waterfront." "Father." "Yes, almost exactly Marlon Brando." They gave him a scar, he was illustrating, pulling at the corner of his eye. That made his eye look a little bit closed, a little dreamy all the time, a little sad. "Well, that's you," he concluded, "Marlon Brando. People tell you that, Father? Do people tell you that you look like Paul Newman?" "Always. And believe me, inside this body, Mr. Newman is struggling to get out. Too crowded. Inside here is also Clark Gable." Half smiling, Karras slightly shook his head and looked away. "Ever done any boxing?" the detective asked him. "Oh, a little." "Where? In college? Here in town?" "No, in New York." "Ah, I thought so. Golden Gloves. Am I right?" "You just made captain," Karras told him with a sidelong smile. "Now then, what can I do for you, Lieutenant?" "Walk slower." The detective pointed to his throat. "Emphysema." "Oh, I'm sorry." "Yeah, sure. Do you smoke?" "Yes, I do." "You shouldn't." "Listen, what's this about? Could we get to the point, please, Lieutenant?" "Yes, of course. I've been digressing. Incidentally, you're busy. I'm not interrupting." Karras turned a sidelong look to Kinderman again with a smile of bemusement in his eyes. "Interrupting what?" "Well, mental prayer, perhaps. I think you're going to make captain soon, you know that?" "Father, pardon me. I missed something?" Karras shook his head. "I doubt that you ever miss a thing." "What's your meaning, Father?" "What?" Kinderman had halted them and mounted a massive effort at looking befuddled, but seeing the Jesuit's crinkling eyes, he lowered his head and ruefully chuckled. "Ah, well, of course, a psychiatrist. Who am I kidding? Look, it's habit with me, Father. Schmaltz, that's the Kinderman method. Well, I'll stop and tell you straight what it's all about." "The desecrations," said Karras. "So I wasted my schmaltz," the detective said quietly. "Sorry." Never mind, Father, that I deserved. Yes, the things in the church, he confirmed. That's correct. Only maybe something more than that, Father. You mean murder? Yes, kick me again, Father Karras. I enjoy it. Karras shrugged. Oh, well, homicide division. Never mind, Marlon Brando. People tell you for a priest you're a little bit smart-ass? Mea culpa, Karras murmured. Though he was smiling, he felt a regret that perhaps he'd diminished the detective's self-esteem. He hadn't meant to. And now he felt glad of a chance to seem perplexed. What's the connection? He said, taking care that he wrinkled his brow. I don't get it. Kinderman moved his face in closer to the priest's. Listen, Father, could we keep this between us? Confidential? Like a matter of confession, so to speak? Yes, of course, Karras answered. What is it? You know that director who was doing the film here, Father? Burke Dennings? Yes, I've seen him around. You've seen him, the detective said, nodding. And you're also familiar with how he died. Karras shrugged. Well, the papers. That's just part of it. Oh. Yes, part. Only part. Listen, what do you know about witchcraft? Karras grimaced in puzzlement. What? Listen, Patience. I am leading up to something. I hope so. Now then, witchcraft. With this subject you're familiar. From the witching end, Father, not the hunting. Karras smiled. Yeah, I once did a paper on it. From the psychiatric end. Oh, now really? Oh, that's wonderful. Great. That's a bonus, Father Brando. You could help me a lot more than I thought. Now then, listen. He reached up and gripped the Jesuit's arm as they rounded a turn and approached a bench. All right, I'm a layman and not very well educated. I mean formally, Father. But I read. Look, I know what they say about self-made men, that they're horrible examples of unskilled labor. But as for me, I'll speak plainly, I'm not at all ashamed. Not at all. Abruptly he arrested the flow and, looking down, he shook his head. Schmaltz, he moaned. I can't stop it. He looked up. Look, forgive me, you're busy. Yes, I'm praying. The Jesuit's delivery being dry and expressionless, the detective abruptly halted their walk. You're serious? He asked. And then he answered his own question. No. He faced forward again and they walked. Look, I'll come to the point. The desecrations, said Kinderman. Do they remind you of anything to do with witchcraft? Yeah, maybe. Some rituals used in black mass. A plus. And now Dennings, you read how he died. Yes, in a fall down the Hitchcock steps. Well, I'll tell you, and, please, confidential. Of course. The detective looked suddenly pained as he realized that Karras had no intention of resting on the bench. He stopped and the priest stopped with him. Do you mind? He asked wistfully. What? Could we stop? Maybe sit? Oh, sure. They began to move back toward the bench. You won't cramp? No, I'm fine now. You're sure? Yes, I'm sure. Kinderman settled his aching bulk on the bench with a sigh of deep content. Ah, yes, better, much better, he said. Life is not totally darkness at noon. So okay now, Burke Dennings. What about him? The detective stared down at his shoes. Ah, yes, Dennings, Burke Dennings, Burke Dennings. He looked up and turned his gaze to Karras, who was wiping sweat from his forehead with a corner of his towel. Burke Dennings, good father, the detective said evenly and quietly, was found at the bottom of those steps at exactly 5 minutes after 7 with his head turned completely around and facing backward.